it is finally time to get writing. Hey fresties, welcome back to Wattpad Wednesdays, and welcome back to the series where I am taking you through every single step of my process for writing a book for Wattpad. We covered the idea, we covered the characters, and we covered the plotting, so finally, it is time to cover the drafting and editing part of the process. Thanks to the fact that, like I talked about in my previous video, I outline everything, even the chapters. Getting started with drafting is really easy. I never have to pause and wonder what's gonna come next. I never have to sit down and brainstorm because I already know exactly what's going to happen. All I have to do is sit down and start with chapter 1. Typically, I do like to write chronologically, but if I'm having a lot of trouble with a certain scene or certain chapter, or if I'm feeling particularly inspired for a specific scene in the book, I'll let myself jump around and skip ahead to different parts depending on what I feel like writing that day. But I will say that for the most part in my process, I do write chronologically. It just really helps me stay in my characters' heads and understanding where they are at that point in the story. When it comes to drafting, I sort of do two different methods. One of them is just sitting down, writing, letting whatever is in my brain flow out for the day. The other method would be Pomodoro sprints. I prefer these for when I'm not feeling particularly inspired that day and I just feel like I'm gonna sort of worry too much that the words that I'm putting down onto the page aren't good enough. To try to prevent that from happening, I put on a timer for 30 minutes and I just try to write as much as I can in those 30 minutes, not worrying about grammar, punctuation, or even syntax. You know, if things sound wacky and they're not very good, it's whatever. I will come back later and I will fix it during the editing part of the process. But when it comes to drafting, I know very well how difficult it can be sometimes to just let yourself write something that isn't going to be all that great at first. I think as writers, a lot of us tend to be perfectionists when it comes to our work and worry a little too much about, is this coming out right? Does this even make sense? Are people gonna picture in their heads what I'm trying to get them to picture? All that stuff. So to try to get yourself out of that mindset and just really focus on getting words onto the page so that you can fix them later, sprints are a great tool. I also find that they make my writing process a lot speedier. If I'm in the middle of a sprint and I get particularly stuck on a description, or if I need to come up with the name of a place or something like that, I will just put in a placeholder. I usually do this with the money symbol and then I just write in all caps whatever it is, like money symbol, grocery store name here, you know, that sort of a thing. Then during editing, I'll come back and I'll fix that. This can also work with lengthy things like a paragraph of description. If I need to write about how a certain character is feeling in that moment and it's just not coming out of me that day, I will just write add feelings here. And then, you know, it's a problem for future me. But present me won't get stuck on it and can move on to the next paragraph and actually get some words on the page instead of sitting there and just trying to come up with something that my brain is just not ready to come up with at that moment. I also find this particularly helpful if you are writing about something that you're not all that familiar with, you know, something that you don't have the most knowledge on and you need to research it. If you try to research it in the middle of when you're writing, chances are you're going to get sidetracked. You may end up on a Wikipedia page that is like 4 pages deep from what you originally went there to search about, and we don't want that. Because if you're distracted, then you're not writing and your draft is going to take a little longer than you would probably like it to. So instead of going and doing that research at this time, just write a little note, you know, something like research this and add more detail later. In the book that I am currently posting on Wattpad, Hearts Like Ours, I did this for the fruit grading machine in the apple orchard because I have no knowledge of fruit grading machines. I don't even know if I knew they existed before I started writing this book. So that was something that I didn't want to get too distracted by, and when I found myself getting way too deep into that, I just wrote a little note of it and bookmarked the pages that I needed, put it aside, and got back to writing. Another thing that I really like to do if I get stuck when writing, especially if it's for the more descriptive aspects of the book, is to read. Now, obviously, I don't mean read and then steal or plagiarize the writings that you have just read, but read just to help get yourself inspired. Personally, I find that something about it just really helps my ideas flow and helps me be a better writer. It helps me word things better and come up with better metaphors, all that good stuff. For example, in my current romance book that I'm working on, if I'm having trouble describing a kiss, I will go to my bookshelf, look at my Nora Roberts books, and read some of my favorite kiss scenes from her works. It's going to give me more ideas about word usage, about metaphors, the way that the words flow together, you know, the length of the sentences, the actions, everything. And I think that reading multiple examples of what you're trying to emulate is especially helpful because it will really take away that worry that you're gonna copy somebody's work or plagiarize or just write something a little too similar to the scenes that you are inspired by. This method is one of the main reasons why whenever I'm reading a book, whether it's physical or digital, I highlight. If there is a paragraph that I am just obsessed with, I will highlight it. If there is dialogue that I think just flows really well, I highlight it. Even just a word that I want to use more often, like I've really been trying to up my verb game, I will highlight it, or I will take that word and I will write it onto a list of words that I want to integrate more into my writing. When you're in a rut, looking at these things can be way more helpful than you expect it to be. And honestly, it's one of the reasons why I suggest you always be reading a book. Something about reading really just makes us better writers, and I need to take my own advice and read more often because I have been slacking lately. So those are my best tips for getting through the drafting part. This takes a very wide range of time for me. Sometimes the process can be 2 months, and other times the process can take like half a year. It has taken longer than half a year at some points because I've taken breaks and everything like that. So as far as timelines go, I really don't have one for drafting yet. Ideally, I would like to have it at the place where it takes me 1/4 of the year to finish one book, 3 months for all the plotting and the drafting and the editing. That would be ideal. So, well, let me not talk while I'm massaging myself. So when I finish my drafting, it's time to move on to editing. And honestly, this is one of my favorite parts of the entire process. It's where you get to go through this story that you have crafted with so much love and just take it from like a 5 to a 10. You just get to craft it into something that is exactly the way that you pictured it being when you first thought of this idea in your head. Thanks to all my plotting, when it comes to editing for me, I really don't have to do any storyline edits. I made sure during the plotting process that all of that was figured out and that I had a nice arc and just a storyline that would really engage my readers. I made sure that I didn't have any plot holes and all that stuff, so I usually skip that part and just go right into line editing. Line editing is where I add details where details need to be added and take away some over-descriptive parts of the story. I also go in and figure out those placeholders that I mentioned earlier, and I fix any clunky wording or confusing sentences. In that same respect, I make sure that my syntax is interesting and that I'm not phrasing sentences the same way every paragraph, that I'm not repeating dialogue tags over and over again or using the same descriptions all over the book. And one thing that I find to be especially important during this part of the process is making sure that all my dialogue sounds in character. When I'm drafting, especially if I am doing a writing sprint and just trying to get those words on the page, I don't always emulate my characters in exactly the way that I know that they are, if that makes sense. I can write them as, maybe a little too abrasive for their actual personality or maybe a little too reserved. I don't want that. Obviously, I want their characterization to be consistent throughout the story, so this is the part where I fix anything like that. After line editing, it's time to take on copy editing. This means fixing all that pesky grammar and punctuation, and personally, for me, a lot of this can actually occur after I start posting my story to Wattpad because readers can often notice flaws that you don't catch in your own story, point them out, and then you can go in and fix them. But even though you can rely on your readers to catch a lot of these mistakes, it is important to try to catch most of them on your own. You don't want to be using your readers as a free way to get help with your grammar and punctuation. You want to give them the best story that you can. It is also helpful to use apps like Pro Writing Aid or Grammarly, things that are going to be able to catch a lot of those simple mistakes that might just fly under your radar. But at the same time, it's important to note that sometimes these tools are not always 100% accurate, and they may suggest something to you that isn't correct or that you think would actually hinder your story. Most of the time, the only things that I use them for are grammar and punctuation. I don't really use them for taking away adverbs or making sure that words are used in the right way, because I think that that's more appropriate for nonfiction writing, and I'm focusing on fiction writing where writers get more liberty to use words in ways that might not be appropriate in a nonfiction setting. What is that called? Artistic liberties? Is that what I'm thinking of? Artistic liberties, yeah. Oh, also, I think I forgot to mention, when I'm drafting, I don't focus too much on the word count in individual chapters. I try to keep it around 1,500 to 2,500 words per chapter, but really, I mostly just try to focus on, you know, where does it make sense to end this scene in relation to making a chapter that has interesting things in it but isn't overwhelming or underwhelming to a reader. So once I am done with those edits to my story, I am officially ready to prepare to post it to Wattpad. That was a very clunky sentence. So next week we will talk about how I prepare to post a story to Wattpad and get everything nice and ready and looking good for the readers who are gonna click on it. So I hope this video— I don't appreciate that. So I hope this video was helpful, and I hope that it was helpful to get some insight into somebody else's writing process and just see how I do things, how I make sure that my story, when I post it, is going to be the best that it can be, but how I also make sure that it doesn't take me too long to get it to that point. I hope I'll see you in next week's video. Thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, all that good stuff, and thank you again for watching. Sure, that's a fine outro. I'll get the hang of this one day. My hands are freaking weak, dude.